All right, thank you very much for agreeing to participate in the FM Redzone Digitized Conversation Series in partnership with Redzone. And we are, of course, having this conversation. And what it's about reform black text towards a self-sustaining audience for business and brands on this, the 27th of July, 2021. And I hope everyone is keeping nice and warm in their igloos, because right now we're all Inuits. It doesn't really matter which part of the country you basically joining us from. Before we do all of that, I really do think that it's quite important that we set the scene and set the context with a bit of a very short video that will give you a sense of what it is that we are talking about. So what we'll do, as soon as we play this particular video, is that we will then introduce our first guest. And of course, I will introduce them as the time comes. But for now, for 6 minutes, just watch this particular video. It's about 6 minutes. Just pay attention to it, and then we'll set the scene for the conversation that is about to follow. So watch this little short video.
The reality of South Africa's need for new ways to address our economic realities has never been clearer. But it's always worth remembering the facts and figures. Stats SA's report on inequality confirms that we live in a country where 10% of the population has up to 58% share of income. That same 10% have approximately 95% of all wealth. In an effort to deal with these gaps, new sources of income have become necessary, and black tax, the concept of continued financial contribution to the overall household income by individuals who can afford it, has long been fit to mitigate these and other forms of inequality. Like any other tax system, black tax should serve the people who fund it and benefit from it. And there is a model that could make that possible. Yet it has become fatalistic, particularly for black Africans. It has become an increasingly burdensome obligation as unemployment levels rise and fewer financial resources are available to fund a widening list of direct and indirect dependents. It has been attributed with reducing the disposable income available for our labor market income earners, and in many ways, it has been seen as being attributing with knocking down the chances of building generational wealth. So despite the progress that's been made over the last decade, the majority of families are still left out of the financial services mainstream. So we have a few questions in this grim reality. What becomes of financial stability and self-sustaining populations? Can black tax be more impactful to what matters to financial stability? And seeing what the sharing economy has changed in financial systems and the value created for people and businesses, could the same be done for the spirit of Ubuntu? In truth, families should help each other. Importantly though, families should be able to help each other. The challenge is that our current approach to families helping each other has become fundamentally flawed. Today's black tax model is largely a cash transfer system, from those with higher incomes sharing what is an increasingly complex networks of dependence and extending list of needs for the arguably diminishing base of income. What if we reframed the definition of assets available from the income earner and applied financial wealth creation principles beyond cash? Funding black tax with a financially recognizable resource network that enables broader financial participation. Include time, property assets, access to finance, access to information, credit reputation, access to medical insurance. The resources available to fund black tax could be significantly expanded. We want to present a new model for black tax families. Family-based and a focused model to tackle the systemic challenges to families' financial progress that make black tax efforts ineffectual today. It's designed to redefine what financial assets family members can share beyond today's definition and create a financially viable model out of the essence of Ubuntu, much like the sharing economy has achieved. Our model has a number of key enablers to its success because it rethinks the essence of black tax and makes it meaningfully represented in our financial system. It needs financial advisors and some real practical financial education for families. It needs an integrated digital system to recognize multiple participants as part of one network. It needs a powerful banking partner who can enable the family to transact and have visibility of their collective assets. It requires an insurance provider, perhaps medical at first, incubators for SMEs, schooling partners to secure the younger members of the family, and of course, potentially an incentive structure for the pilot participants. But here's what it proposes. It proposes an inclusion of all the extended family members for what they have and what they don't have. And here's how it would work. You would recruit the extended family network via the student or the black tax supporter. You would allocate a financial advisor who would profile each family member to understand their position in the network and their primary barriers to financial freedom. You would build a family financial plan over a set period based on the ideals and the family ambition, and then allocate family resources beyond cash, allowing, for example, the following. Address the indebted with a targeted plan that liberates cash reserves. Allow family members to enlist non-dependents as dependents to share the family's medical burdens. Focus those with good credit reputations to be part of recognized business loans for SME efforts, connecting that surety to an incubator program, and enabling the unemployed in the family to establish a business that hires the educated but unemployed, as well as the uneducated, to build a business that serves their family network. Thereafter, agree the inputs and commitment from each family network member, applying incentive principles to make the program work. Conduct the pilots with regular interval check-ins with their financial advisor and leverage transparency enabled by the digital system. Reforming black tax could present an unbridled opportunity if we could show a refined understanding of how a black family's wealth is distributed amongst different age cohorts, from the school-going children to the unemployed, the employed, and the retirees. Unlocking this inherent value needs a new model and demands that financial services providers to build products appropriate for the family's circumstance and around people. It presents us with a way to preserve the spirit of Ubuntu inherent in black tax and gives the current income generations, millennials, Gen X's, and Gen Z's, a fighting chance at building wealth. It is possible to make black tax a more constructive solution that has greater impact if we can leverage the Ubuntu and into a reinvention of a financial model that serves the participants.
All right, what you've just seen is just 6 minutes of a scene setter for the conversation that we're wanting to have. And my name is Ntombizamasala Hlophe, and I am an author. I am a presenter, sometime presenter on radio, columnist for the Sunday Times. And I've been asked to help facilitate this conversation that we are about to have. And the conversation is with myself, Ntombizamasala Hlophe, who's strategy director at Yellowwood. And of course, we are also joined by Samgen Hlongo, who is the founder at TNC Wealth Partners. And of course, we also then have Amkhelang Hlomilang, who is a fixed income report trader. And welcome to everyone. They are going to introduce themselves a bit more extensively, well, just a little bit more when I first ask them their questions. And what we're going to be trying to do in this conversation, we'll succeed in doing this, is that we want to keep this as interactive as we possibly can make it interactive. And so you can start firing as soon as we start the conversation, start firing those questions that you have. And the conversation is, of course, about black tax. So what happens is as soon as you start talking about black tax, and I think we all just start going into our binaries. We start wanting to think about, are we for or against it? Or are we part of the group of people who think that perhaps we shouldn't even be calling it a tax and so on? But to help us just set the scene about exactly what it is that we are doing here, because we're having a bit of a different conversation. And the conversation here is not so much about the conversations we've had. We've all read these essays and these articles about black tax, where some people say, well, this is about Ubuntu, it's not really a text, and so on. And so we'd like to just have strategy director at Yellowwood, Ntombizamasala Hlophe, just to set the scene for us about why we're having this conversation. Zama?
Hey, Ntombizo, thanks so much. I love how you got stuck there between calling me my full name and Zama. Zama's just right. So we're having this conversation, I think, largely because a lot of time has been spent, like you were explaining, on debating whether or not black tax should exist. And we've gotten to a point, certainly from our point of view, where it actually almost doesn't matter whether or not it should. The truth is that it does. So what we are concerned with is how adequate is that system of trying to help have families move each other out of poverty? How useful is it for the participants in that system? And how productive is it in actually moving us out of that? And so what we've done is that we've spent quite a fair bit of time really just thinking about what is inadequate about the black tax system. And that's a large part of what we're unpacking in that video, is just the truth of it is burdensome to the people who fund it. It is inadequate for the people who benefit from it. And it certainly doesn't work for anyone who is the businesses and brands around that audience trying to make a viable audience out of them. And so at the end of it is that it's inherently inadequate and it's quite fatalistic. So we're trying to now start to think about, if it is something that people are doing every day, what is possible if we started to rethink it? What are the parts of it that we could restructure? And what alternative models could we put that could serve both people and all people, brands, and businesses who are within the network of black tax and around it?
Of course, I've successfully managed to start speaking without unmuting myself. Brilliant. But anyway, what I was saying, thank you so much for setting that scene, Zama. And, you know, when this conversation, when I was, of course, approached by Zama to just participate in this conversation, it was so fascinating because I happened to be in Durban at the time, because I come from Durban. And when this conversation, we started having this conversation, Zama and I was in Durban purely because it was still part of my black tax duties, because I live out in Gauteng. And this is when things kind of fell apart in the last couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago. And my first question is going to be to Samke. Typically, how does black tax currently work? And who does it affect? So who are the role players? I mean, who are we talking about? I mean, this is, if someone's is listening to us and participating in this conversation, and they are out somewhere in, I don't know, in Alaska, and they're not quite sure what we're talking about, how does it currently work, and who does it affect? Who are the role players?
Thank you, Ntombizo. Thank you, Ntombizo. So currently, black tax actually affects people from different races, whether you're Black African, whether you are white, Indian, of Asian descent. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see a number of people actually debate quite emotionally this idea that we call it black tax, because it kind of restricts it to a certain racial group, when there are white people that say, hang on a minute, I support my family and friends. Hang on a minute, I've got my mother staying with me in my cottage and I have to pay their medical aid bills, or people from Indian descent saying, I'm sending my siblings to school. So it's not a phenomenon that is restricted to one particular racial group, but rather a phenomenon that is prevalent in those individuals that find themselves as the first generation to make a huge leap in terms of the incomes that they're earning, the education that they have attained, and the type of work that they're doing. So being employed in the formal sector and the services sector, as opposed to being in the blue blue-collar informal sector. And so I think if you are joining us from the international community and trying to understand what we mean by this phenomenon of black tax, we can actually just summarize it as being the burden on the first-generation earner or highly educated individual in relation to the generations before them, or in relation to their siblings and cousins, and that burden being a financial one to then use their earnings not to actually advance themselves and their nuclear family, but rather to use their earnings to actually support then the needs of their parents or the siblings that are coming after them or that are around them, and not necessarily have the same opportunity in terms of education and earnings.
All right. And then, Samke, I think you framed it quite well. And when people talk about black tax, right? What are some of the negative connotations that come with the term itself? And so basically what I'm asking is that why would it be burdensome? Why do people feel that that this is burdensome? Because in as much as we're not wanting to have a debate about whether it's tax or whether this is just the natural order of things, but what makes it so burdensome for people?
Here's the thing, Ntombiso, it's burdensome in two ways. Number one, it's burdensome because the people that are actually supporting extended family and sometimes even friends feel that their incomes is then stretched beyond their needs. So it impacts their ability to budget adequately. It impacts their ability to maintain a healthy credit profile. It impacts their ability to actually save enough. And which brings me to point two, in that from an asset perspective, it impacts their ability to generate enough assets and collateral to allow them to then better engage with a credit society, to have a better deposit when they're looking to buy a house, whereas now they won't be afforded or granted that home loan at as a favorable an interest rate as that person who's got a deposit to put down or even additional collateral to put down. It impacts their ability to engage in a business activities or even raise business financing because they don't have alternative collateral to put down. So it impacts them from a day-to-day living point of view, and it impacts them from a wealth generating capacity point of view, because it actually limits their ability to create asset bases for themselves that they can either use to leverage on for additional debt and grow their businesses or grow their investments, or actually use in times of economic downturns to rely on to supplement a dip or a drop in income.
I'm gonna bring you on just now, but I see Zama nodding away as some cases speaking. You wanted to say something, right?
I do. I think one of the things that we found that is creating, to the really well articulated description that Samge is referring to, it's that compounding pressure that's coming up in South Africa, in that, firstly, as the inequality gap rises, and the truth is that it is rising, the people who have an income of some form, it's a smaller number, and the people who need a lot more than they did before. That's the first thing. The second thing is that as unemployment numbers rise, that compounding pressure on the few who have to serve the many more is the other thing that creates that burden. There is a point in time where black tax was quite fit, because the impact of having one person who was educated in the family, firstly, the propensity for that person to get a job was far higher than it is today, but also the cost that the rest of the family had to carry was significantly lower. The idea of what it took to get a good education, the cost of getting a home, for example. So the fact that the cost of living has risen so significantly means that the things that we need to service with the cash reserves are significantly many more. And the other thing that I think is really contributing is the reality that there are problems now that we have in South Africa that money cannot solve. And we're finding that there are financial assets that people don't have access to, like Samge is saying, that make it difficult for people to be able to deliver the needs that they have that a financial system is supposed to deliver to them, because the only solution that someone can help them with is always cash. And I'll give you a really great example of, in this past week, and it's a palpable one because it happened within the unrest. What you found is that you had family members who were in Gauteng attempting to help family members in another province. But the truth is that typically what they do is that they'll send money. They'll find some form of cash send system, and that typically solves the problem. But in that past week, that solution of money was completely inadequate. What people needed was access to information, access to other forms of support. They needed knowledge, who to contact, networks, understanding the reliability, for example, of searching on Google which stores were open. All of those kinds of solutions were completely what people needed, but the system that people support each other with today does not give them that information to each other. And that's part of what we're realizing, is that the burden is growing not just because there's less money on the table, but it's growing because the problems are evolving, but the solutions are not.
Let me rope you in here. Just two things. You've heard what Samke has to say, and you've heard the rebuttal from Zama. Can you just speak a little bit to what Samke was saying, but also just move to how can the model work in the South African market, and what changes need to be made in the way of business, in the way that we operate here?
Yeah, I mean, to a very large extent, in fact, to the full extent, I agree with what Zama and Samke had to say. I think just from a financial standpoint, the word burden, is very much used even in finance, sort of world. From a company perspective, you talk about financial burden, So as people and as individuals, it's quite a befitting term to call it a burden, because over and above, the emotional taxation that goes with black tax, the financial one of it is actually a big part of it. If you're, for example, wanting to sponsor, a sibling or a family member to go for further education, even for basic education, that's a financial responsibility. And when you're looking at what we call now wealth creation, we're seeing that becoming a tougher and tougher thing to do, particularly for, I would say, Black Africans, because in South Africa, that is sort of the majority group of people that is affected by black tax. This is not to say it doesn't affect, people of other ethnicities, but it's quite prominent and prevalent in Black Africans, So we have seen, if you study the numbers, we see that the poverty rate continues to grow. Wealth creation is quite minimal. But when you look at the number of educated Black South Africans, the actual absolute number is increasing. Yes, relatively it's smaller according to where it should be and according to the grand population, but the number is increasing. So we sit and ask ourselves the question to say, then why are we not seeing black tax almost dissipating, going the opposite way? And it's not, because one, wealth creation is not happening. For me to create wealth, I need to be able to say, here's my balance sheet, and it's good for certain kind of investments. I think Samke alluded to collateral availability if one wants to take out debt from financial institutions. That by itself disappears. And I've seen also with most of my colleagues, so even just people that I know, that, when you have a lot of black tax, as I said before, there's such a heavy emotional burden. So it becomes very selfish, for lack of a better word, for you to go on and invest for yourself and buy assets that create value in the future if you actually are not looking after the basic necessities of your family, which is quite a big issue in South Africa. So that is one thing. The second thing is that even financial institutions, they do not take into account what burdens a person of that stature sort of carries, i.e., we don't see companies taking responsibilities in terms of paying people with financial tax, with black tax, a little bit more, and those debates have been had in the past to say, listen, if you go and you impact on somebody who has 10 dependents, you're actually touching a lot more lives. And there is that spillover effect. Unfortunately, we have seen a lag in the South Africa sort of business economy or employment economy, where, the people with the heavy black tax actually, unfortunately, seem to be at the bottom of the income spectrum, and it's very displeasing to see. But that is one of the things that are actually slowing down this dissipation of black tax. That is to then say, if a financial institution is to allow me opportunities to grow as someone with black tax, am I the right candidate? And the answer is an outright no. right? It's no because one, I don't have savings. It's no because two, I probably default on some of the debts that I have because of black tax. And three, I actually don't even advance my education myself, which, by the way, is perceived very favorably from financial sector perspective. It seems a person who's more educated is seemed to be less risky. So that opportunity also dissipates because I actually don't have surplus income in order for me to sort of address that need. So it's a very, very big issue. And I think I love the model that Yellowwood has come up with to say, listen, how about, you have a different view to this? Look at, here's a person, you're investing in them, yes, by maybe giving leverage, but are you just giving leverage to AMU? Or are you giving leverage to AMU based on what the funding will be used for? We see it a lot in companies because companies come and say, listen, I need money for X, Y, and Z. And if the business or if banks believe in that X, Y, and Z, they'll price you favorably, right? So the use of funds is very important because you take the risk on the result of the use of funds. So I think, with black tax, that sort of perspective is actually quite important, for financial institutions, for investors out there to be able to say, listen, if I'm going to extend liquidity or funding to you, what are you going to use it for? Yeah.
As South Africans, we tend to be very good at articulating what the problems are. You're talking about this model, the Yellowwood model, Zama. I'm wanting to rope you in right now. In very practical terms, like in a way that whoever's listening to us will understand. Just talk a little bit about what is, where we are right now, and what your model is, in a way that will make me sit back and go, I actually hadn't thought about it. What is this model? How does it work?
Okay, so the first thing is that it moves black tax from cash and it moves it to all the other financial assets that we recognize. So like Amu was saying, that the collateral, it recognizes a family's home, for example. We have families who have a family home, but that asset, because it's not listed to an individual, in today's financial system, it's not seen as something that I could use as collateral for something else. So it starts to recognize that. It recognizes an individual who, for example, may not necessarily have formal education, but has actual capacity to do something. So you find many family members, because of the history, have not been able to get tertiary education. But that individual is uniquely talented at mathematics, for argument's sake. The ability to aid the family to be able to let that skill be deployed to the use of the family. So allow that person to tutor in the family. And so what the model seeks to do is that it moves this idea that wealth creation and that poverty alleviation in South Africa is going to be the work of the sum of individuals, and moves it into the power of the family network. Because when you look at, if you consider a family that has 10 people, today those 10 people in a financial system are in different ways inadequate in their ability to create wealth. One doesn't have savings, another one doesn't have credit, another one doesn't have a good credit record, this one isn't educated. The 10 of them as individuals are not great. But if you combine them as a unit, they're actually a very viable financial entity. They're a network of people who can actually produce work, who can take children to school, who are able to intervene and gather savings amongst themselves. So what we sought to do is to take that very human behavior, which is a classic thing that businesses do often actually, is to look at human behavior and extrapolate the idea of the spirit of Ubuntu that sustains the system and make it a financial working entity. So what we're recommending is allow families who currently are making decisions on the basis of Amu needs help, so Samge, please will you step in and fund this? Zama and Dumiso needs this, so will you do that? Allow those 4 people to actually be recognizable as one system in a financial entity. Just let all of us be visible as part of one network. Immediately what you'll be able to do, and I think what's dramatic is, if financial institutions understood who I send my money to, they would actually already have an inordinate amount of information about what their customers spend money on. You would know the amounts that I purchase at, argument's sake, at a Dis-Chem that are actually much more for my family than they are for me. So you presume that I have an inordinate consumption of healthcare products. I actually don't. It's the sibling, it's a grandparent who needs that. And so I shop there, not because I need it, but because they need it. But as a result, between Dis-Chem and my financial institution, the two of them don't actually know that they're dealing with two different people. They think they're dealing with one person. So it's that idea of going, when we really understand human behavior and we can turn it into viable systems that people can see, a digital system that lets a family be able to understand the transactions collectively, all of a sudden you completely explode the opportunity that's sitting above what our current financial system is able to do. We can finally move ourselves from two parallel systems where there's a formal economy and whatever we think is happening here. And if we made that informal economy work for us, if we made it a system that actually funds and structures the lives of people in this country, we could have untapped opportunities. The things we could do when we recognize the system of Ubuntu as a way of moving assets, as a way of connecting assets to each other, is exactly what we're concerned about. And that's what our model seeks to do. It seeks us to stop being concerned about the way that financial structures work today, the products, and trying to find a more interesting way of selling them. And actually, we just get down to the heart of what's stopping people from doing what we want them to do, and then give them the system that allows that. And when you do that, people explode things incredibly. And we've seen it with the sharing economy. We've seen it with the likes of Uber. When you allow people to do the thing that's most natural to them, it creates the untapped opportunity of capitalist dreams, effectively. And that's what we're aiming for.
All right, and I'm hoping you guys, the questions that have been coming through.
Sorry, whilst you're looking for those questions, can I just jump in there? So Zama, from my understanding, are we then saying with this model, families are pulled together and seen as one entity? So i.e., I'm to liken this to a situation of a married couple, so looking for financial aid, for lack of a better word, there is what you call, spousal financial support in order to sort of beef up or to improve your portfolio, your balance sheet, to make you more credit worthy. Does the model then suggest that, the four siblings are then perceived in that way as one entity, where they're financially tied for the duration of the investment?
Yeah. So I think that's because it's an opt-in system, absolutely, right? So what we're thinking about when we want to pilot this program is to say, allow a family to opt into exactly that, to saying, this is all the assets we have, this is what we don't have, but let's recognize some of the assets that we've already invested in. So like you say, in a married couple situation, you might find that one person is working and the other one isn't. Already, what that couple suffers from is that our financial system doesn't recognize the one who's not an income earner, right? However, what this model is suggesting is saying, if you have things like SMEs that are circling around trying to deal with the problem of poverty, but what the SME incubators, for example, struggle with in the funders, they struggle to find the right sureties for their investment. Now, let's take this couple example. One is employed, this one isn't employed but is educated. What you're able to do is to offer the one who is employed as surety for the SME incubator investment. And that's what we're trying to do, to look at is when you look at the way that that Black tax is open, right? It always automatically takes on the next member. What our financial system struggles to do is that it never recognizes the next member. It does until they have some form of legalized, and it's strange that we need a legalized family connection over and above being family, right? So it's odd that Amu can have a sibling that won't be recognized in the financial system, but she'll spend 25 years with that sibling, and then she gets married, and a year later, that person can be recognized as a financial entity. And that's part of what we're trying to deal with is in the time that currently families and the family networks spend building a financial profile, building the behavior, and because actually they will always be connected to each other, why not spend time in that structure rather than in these over-the-top structures that we keep trying to build because we trust them more than we do what people do quite naturally? I hope I explained it well to you.
Yeah, at the risk of making this a bilateral conversation, let me just jump in there. I think I like the use of the word surety, because you're just basically saying, I'll stand in good for you, financially where you lack, So as you're speaking there, I'm asking myself to say, but where would the financial institutions draw the line in terms of who is family, and who can be recognized as a dependent, because as Africans, we tend to have families and then extended and double extended, and we just see them as sisters and brothers, But from a business perspective, there has to almost be a clear line to say, well, where do you draw the line? I'll give an example to say, if, for example, you want to add someone onto your medical aid as a dependent, there's often the question of who is actually your dependent. Is this somebody who lives with you, or is this somebody that you maintain from afar? So there are almost all these very tricky things, which for me don't fully define dependent from a Black text perspective or from an African perspective, because oftentimes when you get freedom, you want to run away from home, especially if you come from a very burdensome home. You just want to run away and live alone. It doesn't mean that your family that is afar is not your dependent. So I think I absolutely like the idea of surety, but I think just as something to consider is to then say to what extent does Black text or maybe the family structure or the dependent structure extend?
I think maybe Sange might have some experience in this, and I'm just inviting her to add on. But one of the things for me that is interesting is when we start to enable people to define dependence, you might find that actually there's quite a natural definition. We may choose to quite simply go, it's dependent on the basis of that you can demonstrate that there are other things that they depend on you for, right? So like you say, there is double extended family, but the fact that that person is living in the home with you makes them a dependent. And I think it might be interesting to start to have definitions and financial definitions that actually serve the people who use the system. Typically, if you think about the difference between what brands typically promise when they do their communication as financial brands, they talk a lot about financial liberation. They talk a lot about enabling you, but the process of getting you from where you are to the promise of their product has little to do with enabling you, and a lot more to do with like you say, the limits, the definitions, the guidelines, the actuarial risk measures, for lack of a better word. And so that know your customer form, what it asks for versus the true barrier of financial liberation and the things that are standing in my way are not the same thing. And I think it would be interesting to see a form, for example, that says dependent. How are they a dependent? I think that alone could really be a transformative thing, because even if in filling in the forms we do today, if brands and businesses were interested in what is it that informs the way that I see myself, we might actually already have developed solutions and products and propositions that already serve that. What we don't have is we don't have this curiosity about why do people have an alternative family network system? Why do people spend money in that? It's almost as though as people who are practitioners in business and with brands, we're only interested when they've figured it out and when they're available to spend and when they're available to pay our fees. But I think an interest beyond that and an interest in the barriers would really make a huge difference in us finding the right definitions. But I think your question on the model is well worth it, and I've written it down. I don't know, Samge, if you had any views on those dependent definitions. And I'm just doing this because I think we'd lost Ntombizamasala, but he's back now.
I do, Zama, I do have views. So if you look at the way that the current the current Pension Funds Act defines dependents. It's basically anyone that can prove financial dependence or receiving some form of financial assistance from the deceased, especially with deceased estates. This is where it comes into play for the past 6 months and beyond. So if you are a side chick and you can prove that actually daddy has been sending me money for the past 6 months, guess what? You are a dependent and entitled to a share of the deceased's pension. But here's the thing. My argument, especially even from my MBA research into over-indebtedness and what drives over-indebtedness in my sample population, which was actually females that are tertiary educated between the ages of 25 and 34, living in urban areas with full-time employment, was that it was beyond just the financial, it was beyond just the financial literacy, but this kind of obligation and responsibility, feeling of responsibility in assisting. And so one of the recommendations I made was that we definitely do need financial services to actually kind of look behind the transaction to the nature of the transaction, because currently if you have a personal loan of 100,000 Rand, whether that 100,000 Rand was used to go on holiday or to pay for your siblings' school fees, your credit scoring will be the same. It doesn't look at the nature of the transaction. But the counter to that is that we're now taking a social problem and we're making it the problem or the preserve of capitalist and profit-driven organizations. And so my challenge to your model, Zama, would be, in the absence of having proven to me the value that I stand to gain as an FSP or a brand in taking the additional efforts in actually kind of looking beyond the transaction and looking beyond the formal definition into the informal definition of what a dependent is, the informal kind of structure that you're now proposing, which is a household approach as opposed to an individual approach, in the absence of you showing me the value I stand to gain, I really have very little motivation in going to that trouble, in upsetting what has worked for hundreds of years.
All right, I am back. Before I was rudely interrupted by our connectivity. I was going to say that we had promised when we started that this was going to be as interactive as possible. Just nod, Amu. I saw you scribbling furiously. Were you taking notes of the questions that were coming directly at you? Because I'd like for you guys just to have a look. Otherwise, Tanya, if you could just beam the questions again, because we, the participants have been asking us questions since we've started. Who is ready to answer a question that they have noted that has come from one of the participants? Who's willing to go first? Okay, so there's a question from Putela to Samke. Between males and females, who are the biggest contributors? Did you get that one, Samke?
I'm seeing this only now, and Ntombiso, I'm not seeing the questions from the participants, only from Tanya.
Yeah, she's writing them on behalf of the participants, eh?
Yes, so that's the first one I'm seeing. Between males and females, who are the biggest contributors to family welfare, and how do traditional customs play a role? That's a very loaded and difficult conversation, Putela. What I can tell you is that traditionally, in the traditional family structure, males were the ones that were actually contributing more financially to the family welfare, and the females more focused, even if they did contribute financially, but kind of more focused on the nurturing and the running of the home. What we're seeing now, and has been confirmed by statistics from FNB, showing that the biggest segment of new home purchases are actually single income households led by females. So women are getting on with it. If you have found yourself in a position where you're not married yet, we're not waiting to get married before we move out of home. We move out of home, we buy our property. If you are divorced, you're not waiting to get married again before you are in a family structure. We get on with it, we're buying our own properties. So you're finding a rising prevalence of female-headed households, and females actually tend to be the primary caregivers of children. So even in those instances where there are children between two parties that are not married, you find that the child will be living with their mother, and therefore you've now got this burden of a female who earns relatively lower to a comparable male in terms of the gender income gap, has a lower mathematical and financial sophistication ability, and this is confirmed by the 2012 National Financial Literacy Survey conducted by the Human Sciences Research Council. And so you're finding someone who earns relatively less, has a bigger burden, has a lower mathematical ability, having to now run this household. And so we're finding a rise in this phenomenon of not the gender income gap, but the gender wealth gap, where even cumulatively the impact of the wealth that a female can generate vis-a-vis a male leads to a gap of about $900,000 at retirement age. And so this is as a result of a number of influences, some being a lack of confidence in negotiating interest rates with the bank when being advanced debt, a lack of confidence in negotiating the sales price when buying an asset such as a house or a car. So you're finding someone paying more in terms of the purchase price and higher interest rate in terms of that debt. So as it stands, to answer your question directly, who contributes more to the household? The nature of the household has changed. So I cannot give you kind of a direct answer to that, because what sort of household are we talking about? You now have a higher number of households that are female-headed, where there is no male. And so it's then difficult to answer that question because we're assuming there's a male in that household. So the nature of what households look like has changed. And so I think that question, we need to then have a different layer attached to it in order for us to have a more direct or applicable answer that I give you.
All right, don't hold back now, Samge. Don't hold back at all. we've got a question for you, Zama, and that's related directly to the model and how to get it off. Amu, I hope you saw the question. Just be ready after Zama. The question about is black tax some form of crutch? But yeah, Zama, just in terms of the model and how to get it off. So we're now talking modalities and how to get it off. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think just to recognize the question. So what would it take to get the pilot of this model off the ground, and how could we assess its impact in the short term so that we can motivate scaling the model? I do think that one of the most effective things would be probably to find a family, right, willing to effectively model the behavior without having the system intact, right? So if you think about how today, when I talk about transparency in a digital system, you can achieve that if everyone in the family was willing to share their expenditure and spreadsheet it, for example, right? You could absolutely achieve that. The idea of getting a financial advisor today is a totally viable notion. So you could assign someone who could convene the family in that frequency to communicate the needs that each family has at the beginning of the year, for example, is something that many families do, where they sit down and they plan out and they say, this kid is going into this grade, that one will need this. A lot of families are already doing that. So we could absolutely almost qualitatively pilot it without any of the intricacies that we currently talk about. There are a couple of players actually in the market from a banking point of view who've already created bank accounts where multiple people can actually access one thing. If I remember one, I think there's an account from African Bank that looks at multiple individuals who can access a central banking item. So already that is quite possible. So I think that we could absolutely do. In terms of measuring it in the short term, I think what would be very interesting is for the family to be quite focused on being very specific about its targets. And one of the things that I find a lot of families don't focus on is the idea of focusing on savings. To say, whatever happens this year, here's how much money we want to be able to have in 2021 to fund our ambitions for the following year. And I think that could be a very meaningful, targeted short-term ambition that tests how this model works, because it could look at, have we managed to liberate Zama to contribute the additional X amount of money we need from her? Did we leverage the access that Samge has to information about X, Y, and Z to negotiate a better interest rate for the thing we wanted to buy? So to actually really leverage all of the existing financial assets and to say, as the unit, you are going to spend too much money if you buy it yourselves. Let's rather so-and-so negotiate that for you so that we save X amount of money in terms of how we're going to spend. A lot of the principles that I'm referring to, we could apply in a qualitative one-to-one engagement, allowing a family to actually opt in and then to scale it. And the reason why it needs partners to scale is because when you are talking about multiple families handling that, you're talking about multiple dynamics. We probably, from the questions that have already been asked, is we probably need to think about getting some form of psychologist, right? Because the minute you're talking about families and money, you're activating emotions, you're activating the truth, the history. So there may be a need to help facilitate some of those discussions, to help families make choices about, is it better for us to buy the asset this year, or is it better for us to save that money the following year? So that would be, I think my thinking is to find a family who's willing to pilot the behaviors and actually model the actual actions, make those financial choices based on existing financial principles, and demonstrate what you can achieve within a set time period.
All right, Amu, you've just listened to what Zama has to say about just the practicalities of it. Speak a little bit to it, but then you also have a question that was directed at you, but you just do it in the order that you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the way Zama explained the piloting, because, you know, I was also asking myself the same question to say, how do we prove that the model works? You know, and at the same time, you know, going that route, you know, not to be critical of it, that route in itself almost prescribes for people to say. You know, it's almost like, I'll use the word loosely and say family stock fell, you know, and those are quite popular in Black communities where everyone just contributes monthly and they do whatever it is they agree to with the money, you know. So I'm not fully confident that that would sort of answer Samke's question, which was to say, as an FSP, you know, why would I want to change things? What is the value add from looking at Black tax in that manner, you know? So I think there is still kind of a lot of work that needs to be done to prove the financial benefit to the FSPs, because FSPs are not in the business of, you know, community service, you know, in as much as they do have an arm for that, and they're required by law, you know, to do that, but that's not the core mandate, you know. So I'm also just trying to get my head around how does the risk reward work, you know, for the investor, for an FSP who's going to extend resources. Because it's one thing to save up and say, well, I've saved up, I've got 20% deposit, then I give you leverage. That is already happening. And that is not something that will, you know, especially deal with the Black tax issue. So I think there is quite a bit of work there that, you know, the model would have to address in terms of, as an FSP, why would I want to do this? You know, would I do it because maybe there's scalability? You know, in as much as the margins are thin, you know, if we get more families involved and we get more people involved because there is hope, because people believe there is a solution that is specifically tailored for them, then perhaps, you know, that could be the solution. And but moving on to the question from Zola about how we can use Black tax and whether people use it as a crash or platform to build independence. I think to loosely answer that question, you know, people do complain about Black tax. And I think it is a real thing, you know, otherwise we wouldn't complain about it. And maybe people talk about deploying resources for Black tax and they don't actually do it, which is a discussion for another day. And I think every person has a responsibility to uplift their families, but at the same time without completely compromising themselves. But that's not the discussion here. So I doubt that people use Black tax as a crutch, because you don't get additional compensation or additional benefits for the mere fact that you've got Black tax. So it's not something that, you know, you would want to put out there to sort of elevate yourself. But certainly I think education has to be had about Black tax, and particularly from those that can help, that are in a position to help, you know. And as I said earlier on, you know, outside of this model, I'm personally of the view that entities or companies with employees that have heavy black tax should actually consider remunerating those employees, perhaps a little bit higher, just for the mere fact that they're not just taking the income for themselves, but the income to redress certain issues in South Africa that have resulted in this heavy black tax. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered that question satisfactorily. Zola, you can send a follow-up question.
I do want to just add, Ntombiza, just quickly, there was a question earlier about the contributors between males and females. I think one of the most illuminating sets of information when you were developing this was Stats SA's report on inequality in South Africa was really, really telling, because it really starts to unpack the income contribution by, it does it by household type, it does it by race, by gender, by province even. It also helps to then break down the spend ratio accordingly. So in the beginning of the video, we spoke about how households headed by people who are tertiary educated spend twice that of people who have, I think it's twice that of people who have matric, it's 5 times that of people with a secondary education, and 8 times that of people with a primary education. So you start to see the balance, and it speaks about how that spend is skewed towards males than it is females, even though the burden sits far more towards females. So there's actually quite a fair bit of information that we do have about these dynamics in South Africa. It's just that it doesn't come from sources like these, right? Where the people with the platforms and the ability to have the everyday conversations are feeding that in. But there certainly is a lot of effort being put into understanding the profile of our country to that sense. Then there is just one other question, and I'm mindful of the time, that came through to me about, is the burden of black tax amplified by the fact that South Africa is a predominantly consumer nation and rather a producer nation? And I think it's an interesting one from Putela, because I'm not sure that whether or not we had a big enough GDP is the problem, right? If I just think about the source of our problem as South Africa is not about how big is the GDP. The problem is who has access to that GDP. So and maybe it's an overly simplistic response to you, and I hope that you don't see it as such, but I would propose that even if you rewind 10, 15 years ago when we felt like South Africa's economy was growing, I think we didn't find that the inequality gap was closing. We had participants, we felt like there was more money moving around, but it wasn't actually going to the root of the problem. So I have to presume that perhaps it doesn't compound it. Our problem is the fact that the way that we need our family service, the way that we actually engage with each other is not reflected in the way that our money system works and in the way that our asset system works, certainly. And that's part of why the model felt necessary, that we've got to relook the presumptions we've made about the solutions that exist today.
Being mindful of the time, we've got about 2-3 minutes to go. I'd like just for everyone just to have a bit of an opportunity to just have a short closing statement, a closing reflection on this, because obviously the challenge is practically for all of us is that sometimes, black tax, you kind of feel as if you're spending money towards the past versus actually spending it towards the future, which is fundamentally what this conversation is about. Samke, just briefly, but then also, thereafter, Amu, for yourself to also have just a closing, and then we'll have Zama very quickly. Just what are your closing remarks, Samke?
My closing remark is that fundamentally and in principle, the model seeks to address a social issue, which continues to actually have exponential and compounded effects, even on the very state, being the government, in terms of people that end up now depending on the state or not having enough money to set aside to retire, or enough money to start up businesses for themselves and create jobs for themselves. So, it's a systemic issue. However, I do think that the approach in terms of who the players are that would be interested in adopting this model is a little bit misplaced, in that I still haven't, from a capitalist point of view, see why I would be interested in taking this model up. And so I think there needs to be a matching of the model and its use and its impact with those stakeholders and parties that actually do have the capital, the resources, the network to bring the model to life. And so my closing remark is that it would be a matching consideration, either in terms of shared values, exchange of value, or then perhaps looking at who this model should be addressed at in terms of who to partner with in bringing it to life.
Amu?
I completely agree with Samke there, because no one's going to do anything for free. You know, it's great. It addresses big social issues, i.e. poverty, unemployment, education. I mean, black tax is black tax because of a lot of underlying issues. So, and which are visible to everyone, including, you know, the partners that have been considered for this model. But it doesn't seem that people are being moved that much, because we're not seeing much being done to address the situation. So definitely I'm with Samke on that one, to say there needs to be a value add for the other side. You know, we see the benefit for the families, we see the benefit for the black tax, you know, beneficiaries. That one is quite clear, but we don't yet see why institutions would want to do it. But like I said, you know, just thinking from the top of my head, you know, you can talk about scalability, you can talk about, you know, maybe the risk is not being measured correctly. And that is why institutions are actually not even willing to put their hand in there. You know, if I'm perceived as a junk rated entity, but with the support of my family or whoever who come in surety for me, I may be perceived differently. So stuff like that needs to actually be taken into account to say, how does it make business sense? You know, how do I mitigate the risk and still get the same reward, if not better? Yeah. But I'm quite excited about this, and I'm happy that we're having conversations about black tax, because I'm quite feeling it myself.
Zama, as a wrap up?
I think for me, firstly, an immense amount of gratitude to all three of you, to have the ability to debate these kinds of things is absolutely the ambition we have as Yellowwood, and a lot of gratitude, of course, to Arena and to Financial Mail for partnering with us. But my parting shot for me is that I feel more invigorated towards it because of this discussion. The fact that we were able to not debate whether or not we should be doing something about it, but actually what we're looking at now is what is the criteria for viability? What does good look like to make it worth the effort for everyone that it's asking something from? That's a step in the direction that we're really looking for. And that's our ambition, to be able to help like I keep saying, the barriers that stand in people's way to present an opportunity for businesses and brands. Because when we make them sustainable in a commercial system, that's how they stay sustainable. And they are fit, and that's what people keep investing in. So I am incredibly grateful, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. You have been participating in this conversation about reforming of black tax towards a self-sustaining audience for business and brands. And this has been obviously been in partnership between FM Redzone and with Yellowwood. And hopefully, you know, I think this is obviously going to be a series of conversations. This is just the beginning of it. But also, you know, Zama, in so far as you guys are concerned, really got speed. I really hope that you are starting to chip away at there not being a need to be having this conversation in 5, 10 years. I hope that for you that would be win. But thank you so much to Samke Mhlongo, to Amukelang Tlumilang, and of course Zama Hlophe from Yellowwood.